Rain drummed against the wooden shutters of the cramped cottage as Eleanor Whitmore clutched her newborn daughter to her chest. Outside, voices grew louder, angrier. Her husband's family had gathered like vultures, their words sharp as winter wind cutting through the walls. "She's cursed," came the voice of her mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore, cold and final. "Born with that mark on her face, she'll bring nothing but shame to our family name." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced the burgundy birthmark that spread across her daughter's left cheek like spilled wine. Beautiful violet eyes stared back at her, innocent and trusting. How could something so precious be seen as a curse? "The village will talk," Margaret continued. "They'll say we're tainted. No decent family will want their sons near us with that thing in our house." Eleanor's husband, Thomas, stood silent by the window. Once she had believed he loved her. Now his silence felt like betrayal. When she had married into the Whitmore family 3 years ago, she thought she had found sanctuary from her life as an orphan. Instead, she had walked into a different kind of prison. "Get rid of it." Margaret's voice cut through Eleanor's thoughts like a blade. "Tonight, before anyone else sees." "She's your granddaughter," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "She's an embarrassment," Margaret spat. "Thomas, you know what must be done." Eleanor watched her husband's reflection in the rain-streaked window. His shoulders sagged with the weight of his mother's expectations, just as they always had. He had never been strong enough to stand against her, not once in all the years Eleanor had known him. "The river runs high tonight," Thomas said quietly, still not turning around. "It would be merciful." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She understood now. They weren't talking about sending the baby away to distant relatives or even to an orphanage. They meant something far worse. That night, while the household slept, Eleanor wrapped her daughter in her own wedding shawl and crept from the house. Rain soaked through her nightgown as she stumbled through the darkness toward the raging river. Her feet were bare, her heart shattered, but she carried the baby with reverence, as if she were precious cargo. At the riverbank, Eleanor fell to her knees in the mud. The water rushed past, swollen with spring runoff, dark and merciless. She could throw the baby in as they demanded. She could return to the house and tell them it was done. She could try to salvage what remained of her marriage, her place in the family. Instead, she kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered the only name she had dared to give her: Rose, my little Rose. Then she placed the baby in a wooden crate she had taken from the kitchen, the kind used for storing apples. She lined it with her shawl and pushed it gently into the current, watching as it was swept away into the darkness. Eleanor returned to the house with mud on her knees and tears on her cheeks. When Thomas asked if it was finished, she nodded. Margaret smiled with satisfaction, and Eleanor died a little inside, knowing she had saved her daughter the only way she could, by setting her free on the mercy of strangers and God. Miles downstream, a fisherman named Patrick O'Brien was checking his nets in the early dawn when he heard crying. At first, he thought it was a cat or perhaps a wounded bird. Then he saw the wooden crate caught against the rocks, and inside it, a baby girl with a wine-colored birthmark and the strongest will to live he had ever witnessed. Patrick and his wife Mary had been married 15 years without children. They had long ago accepted that their cottage would remain quiet, their table set for two. But when Patrick carried that baby home, soaked and shivering but very much alive, Mary took one look at those violet eyes and said, "She's ours now." They named her Catherine after Mary's mother. They told everyone she was Patrick's niece from County Cork, orphaned when her parents died of fever. No one questioned the story. In their small fishing village, people minded their own business and helped when they could. Catherine grew up strong and stubborn, with calloused hands from helping with the nets and a voice that could be heard across the harbor when she called the fishing boats home. The birthmark that had been seen as a curse became, in this family, simply part of who she was. Mary would trace it with her finger while Catherine fell asleep, calling it her kiss from the angels. When Catherine was 7, she asked about the mark. Mary told her the truth as she knew it. Some people are born with special signs, love. It means you're meant for something important. Catherine believed her. She grew up fearless, diving for oysters in the cold Atlantic, racing the boys along the rocky shore, and reading every book that came through their village. Mary taught her to sew and cook, but Catherine was happiest outdoors. Hair wild with salt spray, eyes bright with possibility. Years passed. Catherine learned to read the weather in the clouds, to mend nets with swift, sure fingers, to negotiate prices with merchants who tried to cheat fishermen's daughters. She became known throughout the coastal villages as someone who could not be easily fooled or intimidated. When she turned 18, a traveling merchant brought news that would change everything. He spoke of inland families, of tragedies and scandals. Among his gossip was a story about Eleanor Whitmore, who had died the previous winter, alone and friendless after her husband cast her out for failing to give him sons. "Threw her own baby in the river, they say," the merchant whispered over his pint. "Mad with grief she was. The family disowned her after that, left her with nothing." Catherine's hand flew to her birthmark. Something cold and knowing settled in her chest. That night, she asked Mary to tell her again how Patrick had found her. This time, she pressed for details. The wooden crate, the spring floods, the exact location where she had been pulled from the water. "You've always known you were special," Mary said gently. "Perhaps it's time you discovered why." Catherine spent weeks gathering information. She learned about the Whitmore family, their reputation for pride and cruelty. She discovered that Eleanor had indeed given birth to a daughter the night of the Great Spring Flood 20 years ago. She found out about the birthmark that had been seen as a family shame, but Catherine felt no shame. She felt only a growing fire in her chest, a need to reclaim something that had been stolen from her. Not just her name or her heritage, but justice for the mother who had tried to save her the only way she knew how. On a cold November day, Catherine took the mail coach inland to Whitmore Hall. She had saved every penny from selling her catches, enough to buy a proper dress and traveling cloak. But she kept her fisherman's boots and wore her hair loose, the way Mary had always let her. Whitmore Hall stood on a hill overlooking brown fields, imposing and cold. Catherine walked up the long drive with her head high, the letter Mary had helped her write tucked inside her cloak. It was addressed to Thomas Whitmore and explained, in careful handwriting, that his daughter had survived and was now a woman grown. The butler who answered the door looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "Service entrance is around back," he said, moving to close the door. Catherine placed her boot against the threshold. "I'm here to see Thomas Whitmore. I believe he'll want to hear what I have to say." Something in her voice, perhaps the authority she had learned commanding fishing crews, made him pause. "And who shall I say is calling?" "Tell him his daughter Rose has come home." 20 minutes later, Catherine sat in a parlor that could have housed her entire village. Oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmores stared down at her from gilded frames. The furniture was expensive but cold, beautiful but unwelcoming. Thomas Whitmore entered like a man walking to his execution. 20 years had not been kind to him. His hair was white, his face lined with regret and disappointment. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, his eyes immediately going to the birthmark. "Dear God," he whispered. "Hello, Father," Catherine said. The word felt strange on her tongue, like speaking a foreign language. Thomas sank into a chair, as if his legs would no longer hold him. "You're supposed to be dead." Disappointed. He studied her face, taking in the strong jaw, the violet eyes, the mark that had once filled him with such shame. "You look like her, like Eleanor." Catherine's heart clenched at her mother's name. "Tell me about her." For the next hour, Thomas spoke of Eleanor with a tenderness Catherine hadn't expected. He told her about their courtship, about Eleanor's gentle nature and quick wit. He spoke of how his mother had ground down that spirit year by year, turning love into fear and joy into silence. "I was weak," he said finally. "I let my mother rule my house, my marriage, my conscience. When you were born, I should have stood up to her. I should have protected you both. But you didn't, Catherine said simply. No, I didn't. And Eleanor paid the price for my cowardice every day until she died. Catherine learned that Eleanor had never remarried, had lived in poverty, cleaning houses and taking in washing. She had asked about her daughter only once, and Thomas had told her the baby was gone. Eleanor had nodded and never spoken of it again. She believed I had killed you, Thomas said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. She carried that guilt until it broke her. Catherine felt her own tears threatening but held them back. She had not come here to weep. She had come for something else entirely. Where is your mother? She asked. Dead these 5 years, died in her sleep, never knowing you had survived. Good, Catherine thought, then felt ashamed of the emotion, but not too ashamed. I want to see my mother's grave, she said. Thomas led her to a small churchyard on the edge of his property. Eleanor's grave was marked with a simple stone, worn by weather and neglect. Someone had planted forget-me-nots around the base, though they were now wild and overgrown. Catherine knelt in the damp earth and placed her hand on the stone. I'm sorry, Mother, she whispered. I'm sorry you thought I was gone. I'm sorry you died alone. Thomas stood behind her, hat in his hands. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Catherine stood and turned to face him. I want you to acknowledge what you did. I want you to put her name on a proper stone, with words that honor her instead of hiding her. I want you to tell the truth about the daughter you tried to throw away. And if I refuse? Catherine's smile was sharp as winter wind. Then I'll tell the story myself, to every merchant, every neighbor, every business partner you have. I'll make sure everyone knows that Thomas Whitmore tried to murder his own child because of a birthmark, and that his wife died carrying the shame of what she thought she had done. Thomas paled. You would ruin me. You ruined yourself 20 years ago. I'm just asking you to own it. They stood in silence among the headstones, father and daughter, strangers bound by blood and betrayal. Finally, Thomas nodded. What do you want the stone to say? Catherine had thought about this during the long journey from the coast. Eleanor Whitmore, beloved mother. She saved what she could. 6 months later, Catherine returned to find a new headstone in white marble, exactly as she had requested. But she also found something unexpected. Thomas had deeded a portion of his land to the church, along with money to establish a home for unwanted children. It's not enough, he told her when she found him in his study. Nothing could ever be enough, but it's what I can do. Catherine looked around the room where decisions about her fate had once been made. It felt smaller now, less imposing. I'm not coming back, she said. I have a family that chose me, work that fulfills me, a life that's mine. Thomas nodded. I understand, but would you consider letting me write to you? I'd like to know how you are, what you've accomplished. Catherine studied his face, looking for deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw genuine regret and a hope so fragile it was almost painful to witness. You can write, she said finally, but don't expect forgiveness. That's not why I came. Why did you come? Catherine moved to the window that overlooked the river where she had been cast away so many years ago. The water ran clear and bright in the spring sunshine, no longer dark with secrets. I came to finish what my mother started, she said. She tried to save me the only way she could. I came to save her memory the same way. Catherine left Whitmore Hall that day and never returned, but she kept Thomas's letters, filed away in a wooden box Mary had given her. They came monthly, filled with news of the children's home and updates about improvements he was making to the estate. Gradually, they became less about seeking absolution and more about sharing the small details of a life lived differently. Years later, when Catherine married a lighthouse keeper who loved her fierce independence and thought her birthmark was beautiful, she sent Thomas a letter with her new address. When her first child was born, healthy and whole, she included a small photograph. Thomas wrote back with congratulations and enclosed a silver locket that had belonged to Eleanor. Inside was a miniature portrait Catherine had never seen, her mother as a young woman, smiling with hope in her eyes. Catherine never wore the locket, but she kept it on her dressing table where she could see it every day. Sometimes she would trace the birthmark on her own reflection and remember Mary's words about being marked for something important. She had been marked, Catherine knew now, not for shame or hiding, but for survival, for the journey that would take her from a river's edge to a lighthouse on the coast, from being unwanted to being irreplaceable. When Catherine was 50, she received word that Thomas had died. His final letter, written in a shaking hand, contained the deed to Eleanor's gravesite and enough money to maintain it in perpetuity. "She gave you life twice," he had written. "Once when she bore you and once when she set you free. I hope someday you'll understand that she saved us both." Catherine understood. Standing once again at her mother's grave, now surrounded by carefully tended flowers and visited regularly by children from the home Thomas had established, she finally spoke the words she had carried for 30 years. "Thank you, Mother, for choosing love when it cost you everything, for believing I was worth saving even when the world said I wasn't." The river that had carried her to safety still flowed nearby, but it no longer seemed dark or threatening. It had become what it always was, a path from one life to another, carrying those brave enough to trust its current toward shores they never imagined they could reach. Catherine returned to her lighthouse, to her husband who loved her scars, and her children who had never known a world where they weren't wanted. She had found what her mother had tried to give her that night in the rain, a chance to become exactly who she was meant to be. And in the cottage by the sea where Catherine now lived, where storm winds howled and salt spray painted the windows, there was a special shelf in the kitchen. On it sat a wooden crate, carefully preserved and polished smooth. Inside, on a bed of soft cloth, lay the wedding shawl that had once wrapped a baby, bound for an uncertain fate. Catherine's children knew the story of the crate and the shawl. They understood that sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes it means holding on with everything you have. They learned that being different isn't being cursed, and that the marks life leaves on us can become the very things that make us strong. When Catherine's granddaughter was born with a strawberry birthmark on her shoulder, the family celebrated. "She's marked for something special," they said, tracing the red pattern with gentle fingers, just like her grandmother. And in the harbor, where fishing boats still brought in their daily catch, where children still raced along the rocky shore and dove for treasures in the tide pools, people told the story of Catherine O'Brien, the girl who came from the river, who survived what was meant to destroy her, and who proved that love, once planted, can grow anywhere it's given the chance to take root. Some said she was blessed. Others called her stubborn. Catherine preferred to think she was simply her mother's daughter, brave enough to trust the current when standing still meant drowning, wise enough to know that survival isn't just about staying alive, but about becoming the person you were always meant to be. The river still flows, carrying stories from one generation to the next. And somewhere in its depths, where sunlight filters through clear water and fish swim in silver schools, there's a memory of a night when love wore the face of sacrifice, when a mother's desperate choice became her daughter's greatest gift. Because sometimes the things that are meant to destroy us become the very things that set us free. Sometimes the marks we're born with are not flaws to be hidden, but signs of the strength we carry within. And sometimes a baby thrown to the mercy of a river returns as a woman who understands that mercy is not something you receive, but something you create, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, one generation at a time. Catherine lived to be 93, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew they were wanted, who grew up understanding that love is not something you earn, but something you give. Her story became part of the village folklore, told around winter fires and passed down through families who understood that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in wealth or fame, but in the simple fact that love endured when everything else tried to wash it away. But Catherine's story was far from over. As the years passed and her own children grew into adults, she found herself drawn to help others who had been cast aside by society. Word of her journey from the river to respectability had spread through the coastal communities, and people began bringing her children who had nowhere else to go. Catherine's reputation grew not through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency. When the baker's apprentice broke his arm and couldn't work, Catherine appeared at dawn to help knead bread without being asked. When the widow Thompson fell ill during harvest season, Catherine organized the village women to bring in her crops. She understood that belonging was built through small acts of service, one connection at a time. There was young Timothy, born blind, whose family believed he was punishment for their sins. Catherine taught him to navigate by sound and smell, to identify different types of fish by touch, to read the ocean's moods through the vibration of the pier beneath his feet. He became one of the finest net menders in the village, his sensitive fingers finding breaks that sighted people missed. Then came Margaret, a girl of 14, whose pregnancy had brought shame upon her family's name. They had planned to send her away, to bear the child in secret and give it up. Instead, Catherine took them both in, teaching Margaret about strength and dignity, showing her that motherhood could be a choice rather than a burden. Margaret's daughter grew up calling Catherine grandmother, and never knowing she was anything but wanted. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation Catherine witnessed was in herself. Each child she helped taught her something new about resilience. From Timothy, she learned that limitations often reveal hidden strengths. From the twins, she discovered that what society calls a burden can become a blessing when viewed through eyes of love. From Margaret, she understood that shame dissolves when met with unconditional acceptance. Catherine began to realize that her birthmark, which had once been seen as a curse, had become her greatest asset. Children who felt different recognized something familiar in her face. They trusted her immediately because they could see she understood what it meant to be marked as other. Her scar became a bridge between her heart and theirs, proof that survival was possible, that difference could be beautiful, that love was stronger than judgment. Each rescue strengthened Catherine's understanding of her own purpose. She had been saved not just to survive, but to become a bridge between the lost and the found, between despair and hope. Her house by the lighthouse grew larger as her family of choice expanded, rooms added to accommodate hearts that needed shelter. The children she raised went on to become teachers, merchants, fishermen, and lighthouse keepers themselves. But more importantly, they became parents who never questioned the worth of their own children, who understood that love was measured not by perfection, but by persistence. When Catherine was 65, a young minister arrived in their village. Father Michael had heard stories of the woman who took in unwanted children, and he came seeking her wisdom. He had been struggling with his own doubts about God's plan, wondering how a loving creator could allow such suffering among the innocent. The minister's arrival coincided with one of the most challenging cases Catherine had ever faced. A family from the next village had brought her twin boys, aged 8, who had been born connected at the hip. The local doctor had declared them unnatural and advised the parents to hide them away. The boys had never been outside their home, never played with other children, never learned to read or write. Catherine looked at these children, so afraid they trembled at the sound of voices, and saw herself floating in that wooden crate. Different circumstances, same abandonment. She knelt to their eye level and spoke gently. "Would you like to see the ocean? I think you might enjoy watching the waves." For weeks, she worked patiently with the twins, teaching them that their joined bodies didn't make them monsters, but simply made them unique. She showed them how dolphins traveled in pairs, how certain flowers bloomed only when planted together, how the strongest ropes were made of many strands woven as one. Father Michael watched this process with wonder. He saw Catherine teach the boys to read by tracing letters in the sand, their 4 hands working together to form words. He witnessed their first tentative laughter when seagulls tried to steal their lunch. He observed how other children in the village gradually accepted them, not despite their difference, but because Catherine had taught everyone that difference was simply another word for special. Catherine invited him to walk with her along the shore, where Patrick had once found her floating in a wooden crate. As they picked their way over the rocks, dodging spray from the crashing waves, she told him something she had never shared with anyone else. "I remember," she said simply. "Not everything, but pieces. I remember the sound of my mother crying. I remember being warm against her chest, then cold, then warm again when the fisherman picked me up. I remember choosing to keep breathing, even when everything told me to stop." Father Michael stopped walking. "You were just a baby. Babies don't choose such things." Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Perhaps. Or perhaps some souls come into this world already knowing their purpose. Perhaps I was meant to understand what it feels like to be thrown away, so I could better catch those who were falling." She pointed to a group of children playing in the tide pools nearby, her own grandchildren mixed with the strays she had gathered over the years. "Look at them. Every single one was told they were unwanted by someone. Now they're building sandcastles and collecting shells like they own the whole ocean. That's not accident, Father. That's grace working through stubborn love." Father Michael returned to his parish with renewed faith, but more importantly, with a new understanding. He began preaching not about divine judgment, but about divine second chances. His own church became a sanctuary for families in crisis, and he often sent the most difficult cases to Catherine, knowing she would see potential where others saw only problems. As Catherine entered her 70s, she noticed changes in herself that went beyond simple aging. Her memories of that night on the river had become clearer, more detailed. She could recall the texture of her mother's wedding shawl, the sound of Eleanor's heartbeat beneath her ear, even the specific words her mother had whispered as she placed the crate in the water. "Live, little Rose, live and become everything I couldn't." Catherine had never told anyone about these recovered memories, not even her husband. They felt too sacred, too private. But they explained something she had always wondered about, why she had never felt anger toward Eleanor for what others saw as abandonment. Somehow, even as an infant, she had understood it was salvation. On her 75th birthday, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. A young woman named Helen had travelled from London after hearing Catherine's story from a cousin who lived in a neighbouring village. Helen was pregnant and unmarried, cast out by her wealthy family who cared more about reputation than their daughter's welfare. But Helen had not come seeking charity. She had come with a proposition. "I want to help," Helen said simply. "I want to work with you to create something larger than what you've built here. I have money. My grandmother left me a trust that my parents can't touch. We could establish a proper home, maybe several homes for children who need families." Catherine studied this earnest young woman with her fine clothes and educated accent. "What makes you think you understand what these children need?" Helen placed her hand on her swelling belly. "Because I know what it feels like to be told you're a disappointment. I know what it's like to hear people say, 'You've ruined everything just by existing.' And I know what it feels like to want something better for your child than the world is willing to give." Over the following months, Catherine and Helen worked together to establish what they called harbour houses, homes in fishing villages up and down the coast where unwanted children could find families among people who understood the value of second chances. Each house was run by couples like Patrick and Mary O'Brien, childless families who had room in their hearts for children society had discarded. Helen's daughter was born in Catherine's house by the lighthouse, delivered by the same midwife who had helped bring many of Catherine's foster children into the world. The baby was perfect and healthy, but more importantly, she was wanted. Helen named her Eleanor, after the mother Catherine had told her about, the woman who had saved what she could. By the time Catherine reached 80, harbour houses had spread along hundreds of miles of coastline. Children who might once have died of neglect or cruelty were growing up to become productive members of their communities. More importantly, they were growing up knowing they belonged somewhere. Catherine's influence extended beyond the children she directly helped. The lighthouse keeper's son became a doctor who specialized in caring for children with birth defects and disabilities. One of her foster daughters became a teacher who made it her mission to educate children others had written off as too slow or too difficult. Another opened a shop that employed women who had been cast out by their families for various reasons. Each success story rippled outward, creating more opportunities for more people to be seen as valuable rather than disposable. Catherine had started a quiet revolution simply by refusing to accept that anyone was beyond redemption. As her 90th birthday approached, Catherine's health began to fail. She had lived longer than most people of her generation, and her body was finally ready to rest. But her mind remained sharp, and she spent her final months recording stories, not just her own, but those of all the children she had helped raise. She wanted future generations to understand that their family tree had many branches, that love was not limited by blood or law or social convention. She wanted them to know that every person who had been thrown away and chosen to survive was proof that the world's judgment was not final. Catherine's great-granddaughter, now a young woman studying to become a nurse, spent countless hours at her bedside transcribing these stories. "Why is it so important that we remember all of this?" she asked one day. Catherine's voice was weak, but her eyes were still bright. "Because forgetting is how it happens again. Someone decides a child is worthless, and if there's no one around to remember that every child is precious, that decision becomes truth. Stories are how we fight back against forgetting." Helen, now in her 40s and running a network of harbour houses across 3 counties, came to visit Catherine one last time. They sat together on the porch, overlooking the harbour, where Patrick O'Brien had once pulled a baby from the river. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your mother had made a different choice?" Helen asked. Catherine considered this. "I think about it sometimes, but then I realize it doesn't matter. She made the choice she could make with the courage she had. That's all any of us can do. And if Thomas had been braver, if he had stood up to his mother, then I might have grown up as someone else entirely, maybe happier in some ways, maybe more protected. But I wouldn't have understood what it meant to be rescued. I wouldn't have known how to rescue others." Helen nodded, understanding. "So you don't regret any of it?" Catherine's smile was peaceful. "How can I regret a life that led to all of this?" She gestured toward the harbour, where children from 3 different harbour houses were playing together on the beach, their laughter carried on the salt air. "Every pain I suffered, every night I wondered why I was different, every moment I felt alone, it all led to this. To them having something I didn't think I would ever have." "What's that?" "The certainty that they belong somewhere." Catherine died peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by more family than most people could claim. There were her biological descendants, her chosen children, her foster grandchildren, and representatives from every harbour house she had helped establish. The funeral lasted 2 days because so many people wanted to speak about what she had meant to them. They buried her next to her husband in the small cemetery overlooking the harbour. Her gravestone was simple granite, inscribed with words she had chosen herself. She caught what others threw away. But Catherine's true monument was not made of stone. It lived in the laughter of children who had learned they were wanted, in the confidence of young adults who knew they could overcome any obstacle, in the compassion of parents who understood that love was a choice made new each day. Years later, when historians studied the remarkable reduction in child mortality and abandonment along that stretch of coast, they would trace it back to a single woman who had refused to accept that anyone was beyond saving. They would write papers about her innovative approach to social welfare and her influence on regional policies regarding orphaned children. But the children she had saved knew a simpler truth. Sometimes the best way to heal from being thrown away is to become the person who catches others as they fall. Sometimes the greatest revenge against those who would discard you is to live so fully, so joyfully, so purposefully, that your very existence becomes proof of their mistake. And on quiet nights, when the tide is high and the moon is full, fishermen still say they can see her sometimes, a young woman walking along the shore, searching for treasures the sea has left behind, marking each one as precious simply because it survived the journey from deep waters to safe harbor. She is proof that some things are stronger than the current that tries to carry them away. She is evidence that love, once planted in good soil, can weather any storm. And she is the answer to every parent's prayer that their children will not just survive what life brings them, but transform it into something beautiful, something lasting, something worthy of the gift they were given when they were trusted to the mercy of an uncertain world.